Hello, everyone. This is Defense Politics Asia, and welcome to the DPA panel. And today we're going to talk about post-war economy of Ukraine and Russia, and perhaps the rest of the world. I'm going to hand over to Aki to introduce more about this panel.
Hey guys, I'm Aki, and if you've seen any of the past panels or if you've been to open mic, you've probably seen me. I'm from Canada. Even though my background is Indian, I'm ethnically Indian, and today we would like to discuss about the post-war economy of Ukraine and Russia. We're gonna take two scenarios. The first one would be, let's say the war ends soon, and mostly a realistic perspective of how the war would end if it does end anytime soon. It doesn't seem like it, but if it doesn't, with the negotiated settlement, our perspective would be if, let's say, Russia gets to keep just the Donbas and Crimea, whereas Ukraine gets to retain most of its country and leadership. And that would be the best case scenario for that would be the first perspective that we are going to take. Then the second perspective we will take: what if the war goes on for as long as until one or the other side collapses. So these are the two scenarios that we're going to see, and what kind of prospects does each economy, Ukraine and Russia, have? I'll pass on to Coping.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you Aki, Wyatt, and the rest of the panelists for having me on. Thank you all of you watching. I am coping a whole lot, and I'm going to be the guy who kind of doesn't really have much of a clue about anything regarding economics. I don't really know that much about Ukraine, law, and all that jazz that kind of should give me an advantage within geopolitics in general. But that may apply very well to many of you in the audience as well. So yeah, I'll be asking the silly questions and making silly assertions, so you don't have to. If you think you agree or disagree, the comments are there for you to express yourself. And I'm not sure about the rest of the panelists, but I know I at least will be looking at them. That being said, my perspective would be from a Norwegian, because I'm Norwegian. So that's one bias and focus that I will be going by. And yeah, I think I don't really think there is all that much to point out here, except that it's worth noting that in the fact that I am not, anything special, high expert, whatever in this regard, neither of us are actually experts in its entirety. We have some professions and expertise and angles and knowledge, of course, that you also can acquire. But do understand that we are not here to tell you what to think, how to think, and so forth. We are basically showing you what we think and and how that interaction will unfold is for you to enjoy. So yeah, I think that should be enough for me, and I'll pass it on to Abhinav. Abhinav.
Hi. So this is the first time I'm joining this closed panel. I'm Abhinav. I'm from India. My background is in computer science engineering, but I have a master's degree in finance and then in public administration, specializing in environmental science and policy. I've worked in the financial services industry, but then I've been in research, is what I'm doing now. So I'm affiliated with two US universities, Cornell University and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I am doing research right now. But it's in the field of information sciences. It has nothing to do with politics at all. If at all I write any articles, it's always on sustainability and the environmental side. So this is not my area of expertise, except that I'm more or less a student of history. So especially since I'm from India, I do bring the perspective of how India's interactions with various other countries, including China or England, and with Pakistan and Russia, of course, how they come into the picture. So if there are any biases, that would be due to my being an Indian, and then, of course, also being an Indian in the United States. So yeah, that's my brief spiel about myself.
Toby.
Hi everyone, my name's Toby Stewart. I'm from Australia. I don't really believe in economics. I used to be a corporate attorney working with multinationals in Europe and did a lot of business deals throughout the CIS countries, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, also Western Europe. I don't know much about economics. I know a little bit about history. I studied that at military college, but I'm inclined to think that economics is what poor people talk about when they talk about money. Wealthy people just tend to talk about business. But having said that, I can offer some insight into Europe from a detached perspective because I was there for nearly 20 years and saw the way institutions like the EU and NATO evolved. And that's it.
Okay. Hi, my name is Drew, and I'm from Singapore. I have a degree in systems engineering and a master's in business analytics, and most of my career has been either business development or consulting in one form or the other. And yeah, I'm happy to be on this panel.
And I'm Wyatt. I run Defense Politics Asia. I'm from Singapore, and I have no economics background, but I do observe very closely in the field of geopolitics, and somewhat in terms of economics. Definitely not an expert. Don't trust anything I say. Yeah, back to Aki. Yeah, muted.
Aki, you're muted.
The DPA way.
So let's get into it. My first question is actually for coping. As a Norwegian, Norway has played. I don't think we can get into talking about Russia or Ukraine today without talking about Norway because of Nord Stream. Um, have you seen any sales increase or your GDP growth or something like that because of the pipeline that got blown, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2? So have you seen like maybe people are talking about how Norway is doing better economically because they're selling more oil, or the new pipeline that was turned on the same week that the Russian pipelines were blown?
So that was kind of a two-part question, and I think I'll as for the first question, does Norway benefit a lot in terms of the Ukraine war? Absolutely, and it's very easy to see that. And you can as soon as the war broke out, they had record profits, well over 50% on the oil and gas industry, because of the price rises and etc. etc. And the same goes for the arms industry, which had actually had its most noticeable rise during the COVID pandemic as it initiated. And then it got a lot more back orders on weaponaries, much of it going to Ukraine. And it was almost on its way dipping down a little bit before the war broke up. And then it kind of stayed up and has been fluctuating a bit, but it's on an all-time high. It hasn't been a bigger boon since the Iraq war. And if you go to the Oslo Børs, the Oslo stock market, you will see, and you go on Kongsberg being the arms industry of Norway, you will see the graph going up, 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 and with their explanation of, we got this much orders here, orders there, and whatever. Maybe worthwhile noting here that in addition to all these orders here driving up the stocks of the Norwegian arms industry, the Kongsberg Group is only owned by it's slightly more than half of it is owned by the state. So military aid to Ukraine is kind of recircled back into the arms stocks, and they greenwashing is our thing. So the biggest arms industry in Norway also has increased its investment on offshore wind and so forth, using it both as a environmentally friendly alternative, but also as weaning away from Russia. And considering that most of our domestic energy consumption is actually renewable from hydropower and the such, the more gas that we can now, because now the market is kind of cut, right? We have taken the Russian market, or been given the Russian market. So we can put all our oil and gas industries at full production and have record revenues, which we have received quite a lot of criticism for. Um, I guess I could say a lot more to it, but did you ask anything more regarding? Oh yeah, Norway has also committed quite a lot of financial aid. So this will be for 2022. It is approximately close to like $1.1 billion, which I know is a small number, but it's a big number for Norway. Context here: the European Union in its entirety had around $38-39 billion. Noticeable difference here, though, is that Norway has committed to increase that support annually with 50%. So instead of 1 billion, it will be 1.5, 1.6 billion every year for the next 5 years. So they have publicly committed to support Ukraine until 2027. And it is, if I remember correctly, slightly above of all that financial aid is in military aid, which goes back then into the Norwegian arms industry. And that might be telling to how post-war Ukraine might be faring. We can discuss that a little bit later. To your second question regarding Nord Stream, no, well, whether Norway was a part of it, we cannot say for certain. I personally find it very plausible. We had all the good incentives to do so, because now we have ensured to a lot, or at least more ensured, that the Russians will not be coming back and getting the market we have been given. And I don't really think there is that much more to say, unless I missed your question to some regard.
No, you've answered it completely. Just to add to that question, how is there any way that you think that Norway is suffering from the war like EU is? Their inflation is super high. The things are getting. In Germany and UK, at least, I see the recession is, if not here, then coming. So what about Norway in terms of that?
So Norway is in many ways, like, first you must perhaps distinguish, is it good for the Norwegian government on a geopolitical sense? Here, unless we factor in the threat of Russia actually retaliating to anything we do, such as sending weapons to Ukraine, then no, it's actually very good for the Norwegian state, so to speak, and the related interests. But as for the Norwegian population, that will be a somewhat murkier, actually not so beneficial, because we don't see the benefits of the increased oil and gas industry. We actually have fuel price rises, we have electricity rises, and sure, the government subsidizes some of it, but it's only some of it. And the retail business in particular have kind of gouged this as much as they could, because they had already risen the prices in accordance with inflation, and then masked a little bit the reason for having even more profit margins. So prior to the war, the profit margins for the retail industry, I don't remember the name, but like individual business oligarchs that we have, they had record profits with billions extra profit, whereas the rest of the population would have to pay higher prices under the excuse of inflation. And this certainly did not become better with the war in Ukraine, because even though the war in Ukraine actually in many, many ways benefits us in so many ways, that we shouldn't really be negatively affected in terms of energy, in terms of anything really. But the Norwegian population don't really see that happening. It's going into the investor class and the industry class, all those on the top there. But Norwegians don't care to look about that, because it is the symbolism of supporting Ukraine. So that's one of the reasons. It's the propaganda in that regard is very effective, because what they are essentially doing is, we have to deal with these price hikes, and we have to deal with these austerity measures because of Putin. And even though Putin has, like I just alluded to, very little to do with it. So I hope that answered your question. You're muted.
You're muted.
I think that should be the name of the video.
I agree.
So one last question for you. What do you so I think we have established that Norway does have vested interest in this war going on. So they I think that the Nord Stream pipeline, it is the what happened to it. It was more of permanent damage that happened to Russia. So even if the war stops, it's I don't think so that Nord Stream is ever coming back, and I don't think anyone in this panel would think so, unless you think otherwise. You can.
Which is why one of the reasons that I find it plausible. In addition to, I should point out the political facet here that Norway is more or less completely subordinated to the United States, and we have more and more military activity up north with them. As an aside, and maybe not so relevant, but I thought it was worth pointing out, the Norwegian DoD, the Department of Defense, have it on its own public site. It made it clear that in 2012, Russia wasn't considered a threat at all, really. And then fast forward 10 years, and it was becoming the most pressing threat. Then the invasion of the Ukraine, and it was like an extreme threat, I think, the wording that they used. And what I found very telling to like why I think that's not true is because at the very same, this very next sentence in that statement, they pointed out that the Russians had, because of their desperate situation in Ukraine, they had to be evacuating most of their heavy equipment, air defense systems, and so far as I understood it, a lot of their troops. Now, this is according to Norwegian Defense Ministry. How true it is, I don't know, but I find it very telling that they would say that the Norwegian border towards Russia, the Russians have demilitarized to a large extent compared to what they did, yet the threat level is higher. And the argument added to that, because this contradiction is a little bit difficult to square, and what they used as an argumentation was that it is a sign that Russia is becoming more desperate, and that's why we heighten the threat level, because it increases the chance of nuclear armaments. To which my fellow countrymen may want to ask, well, how do we reduce the threat of nukes hitting Norway? Let's say more weapons to Ukraine, I guess. But that could be one thing. We could ask the Americans to nuke Moscow. I'm sure that will help. That's up for, I guess, later.
Does Norway have nukes?
No, we had a nuclear sort of like a research lab facility in Kjærland, which is near Oslo, relatively speaking, and it's or maybe in Oslo, whatever. NATO wanted to put nuclear facilities in Norway very early on. Norway was a part of NATO, like one of the very first members. So we were down, I think it was 1948 or 49. And we did not accept having, one of the conditions that we fortunately managed to get through was that we did not have nuclear installations in, because that would obviously make us nuclear targets. So no, we don't have nukes. We don't have nukes. But the Swedes, on the other hand, they do have nuclear facilities, and thus, if you want, they can have a potential.
One more interest that I just thought of Norway supporting Ukraine is Arctic. So Norway is also an Arctic nation, right?
Yes.
And I don't know how far ahead is Norway among other countries, but Canada and Norway, in my opinion, directly share vested interest in supporting in sanctioning Russia, because it basically gives them more power in the Arctic race whenever it starts or whenever it happens. Right now, Russia is the only country there, but I think Norway and Canada do share that interest there.
I think you are in part correct. I think the distinction here that is worth making is that for Canada, it has a lot more to do with trade routes and so forth that are otherwise accessible through Norway when it's accessible for Russia anyways. And another thing is that I'm not sure what kind of bilateral relation Canada and Russia has in this regard, but Norway and Russia have a lot of mutual bilateral agreements when it comes to fishing rights and such like that, which have been partially sanctioned. But we also have north of Norway, you find an island called Svalbard, which is a sort of special jurisdictional zone that is partly Norwegian and partly Russian. And kind of worth noting that in the beginning of last year invasion and all the sanction packages came across, Norway actually did some measures to circumvent, because the agreement was that we would assist in, we will help each other up there with support and whatever. We will give free access to relatively free access, and like the Norwegian position up there in Svalbard is that because we have a city there, whereas they have more like a mining industry and a very small city population. But and they have our agreements actually during the Cold War, I think, was made then. So we have actually close cooperation there, which got quite complicated with this war because now here we have to go with all the sanctions. And then, as we already know, the West circumvents quite a lot of sanctions, and we did the same because we don't want to be on too bad of a footing with Russia. So, for Russia, Norway, crushing Russia or and sanction them and isolating them wouldn't make any sense because they are so close to us and our natural trading partners. So it's, I think it is. I don't think the dynamic and the incentives are as similar. The most similar facet I would say between Norway and Canada is one, we are the closest NATO allies to the US. Like if you take Europe in particular, it will be Norway, and the UK is a kind of special kind of ally compared to the rest of the EU. And in that regard, Norway and I guess Britain as well is, I'm pretty sure Britain as well is closer to Canada in many political interests, which would have us, get on odds with with Russia. But I think the way the drives from each of the countries are going to be noticeably different in that regard. I hope that answered.
It does. My next question is for Wyatt and Drew. Actually, I recently saw an interesting statistic regarding to Singapore. They are now they're importing a very significant chunk of LNG from Russia. I think they're the sixth biggest importer or seventh biggest, but it's still a big enough chunk for a country the size of Singapore. And I know Singapore initially did sanction Russia. I don't know if they're still in place, but what do you think of Singapore? Do you think Singapore is either benefiting out of the war or doing worse because of it, or what are your guys' opinions as Singaporeans?
Okay, I'll go first. I didn't know that we were buying LNG from Russia, but I'm glad to find out that we are, because Singapore is always okay. We're a very small country, so anybody that wants to mess with us can do so, and so our survival strategy has always been to make peace with everybody and make ourselves useful to everybody. So we're always trying to stay neutral and to help the people on the island keep the cost of living low. We buy our fuel from the cheapest source available. I guess Russia is now one of the cheapest sources, because most of our gas is actually not most, all of our gas is imported in the form of LNG from overseas. So the rates we pay in Singapore is fairly high globally. But while in Singapore, I've not really noticed an increase in the gas prices. I think increased a little bit over the last year. So yeah, the war itself hasn't really affected us. The fuel prices have gone up when the oil prices spiked, but then it's kind of come back down. So yeah, we're far away enough that we're kind of shielded from most of the economic effects of the war.
So in Singapore is one of the most major gas terminal around the region. So even if we don't buy the LNG will still come into Singapore some way somehow. Like someone else, a third party will buy it, and then they will store it in Singapore, and somehow we have Russian gas in our gas terminals and stuff. That's one thing. Geopolitically, Singapore made a misstep when we actually sanctioned Russia, and then we kind of like panicked. Like it's not just like a global stage panic when Russia declared us as an unfriendly country. We panic internally as well, because we have never done something like this before. Like we have never sanctioned anyone before. Our position has always been neutral, always. So except for
Like
Vietnam War,
Switzerland.
we are pretty anti-communist. So otherwise, we always been very neutral, and we don't get involved with overseas conflicts, especially something so far away. And so when we sanctioned And then the rationale we gave is that, oh, this is a principled move, because no, we do not support aggression, an act of aggression against another country. And that pissed off a lot of people in Singapore, because we have a huge Muslim population. And of course, the Muslim population is very attached to other Muslim countries. And then there was like us questioning, so why we didn't sanction the United States for invading Iraq or Afghanistan, or stirring shit in Syria and stuff like that. So the government cannot explain it in a satisfactory way. We totally, the government just panics. When you see multiple ministers come out and say multiple things, trying to pacify the population, they screwed up. So, and subsequently, all the UN votes, we have not voted against Russia. Anything that is critical of Russia, ever since all this, the backlash, we have abstained our votes. So that is actually a sign that the Singapore government have backtracked. And basically, I haven't heard of anything from Russia negatively about Singapore. That means behind the scene, Singapore probably have already apologized or make good with Russia and tell them that we have no choice, which is the reality. We have no choice. That's the truth. We probably have no choice. Our F-35 contracts are up in the air. We have to follow through because F-35 is so damn expensive, and our spare parts is from United States. We have no choice. So I bet Russia also understand. So there must be some kind of deal, which is why when Russia nowadays talk about the unfriendly countries and everywhere, even in the maps, they do not put an arrow out Singapore. Singapore just disappeared out of totally from the headlines and not mentioned by Russia. So that might also probably a reason why there could be Russian gas in Singapore. No, we are not like crazy anti-Russia to the point where no Russian gas at all. No, so that might be a explanation why there is Russian gas in Singapore. Perhaps.
I got a couple of things to add to that. First is, I think we need to understand that the sanctions that Singapore placed on Russia is the bare minimum. It's like you're not supposed to transfer money to Russia to fund weapons or something like that. It was that was the sanction. So that was it. There wasn't any sanctioning of oil or gas or anything like that. We're not allowed to transfer money to Russia. That's it. Yeah. But the weird thing is that so I was planning our year-end holidays with my wife the other day, and then we were thinking of going to. We also asked the kids what do you want to see. They say they want to see snow. So we thought, hey, so we were looking up spots in China, and the flights were very expensive. So then I looked to the right, and there was Vladivostok. So that was Russia, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we thought, hey, why don't we fly to Vladivostok? We've never been to Russia before, and the flights on Singapore Airlines just said unavailable. So apparently we're not allowed to go. There are no commercial flights into Russia. So I guess that is, I found that a little bit weird since that was not sanctioned. So I don't know why Singapore Airlines doesn't fly.
See if you can get the NED to help you out.
The sanctions, I want to just add, there is I just read is export control on anything that can be used as a weapon or contribute to offensive cyber operation. That's one. The number two is financial measures to all financial institutions that subjects to Russia targets Russian banks and entities and fundraising that benefits the Russian government. So basically, all banking activities is actually sanctioned as well. So basically, they can't raise money in Singapore, they can't borrow money in Singapore, which is actually quite severe because Singapore is a financial center, a major financial center in our region.
Is it still there? Or has it been reversed? Still there?
I believe the sanction is still on. I don't think we dare to lift it. Not now, man. We don't dare to lift it. Okay. But of course, like I said, there could be under table things that maybe we secretly just continue to do business, but everything must be.
I don't think Russia raises money in Singapore anyway, right? We're too far away.
Very minimal.
Like a hub for Asia.
They have no needs for us anymore because without the West, without trading with the West, we are useless.
Yeah. True.
Switzerland was the main hub where Russia used to do dealings with money. Drew, if you do want to visit Russia, I don't think that Singapore Airlines go there, but there's Dubai Airlines, there's Turkish Airlines, and airlines like that do go to Russia. And Vladivostok is like on the other end of Russia, so I don't think you'll ever find like a direct flight from Singapore there, even if the sanctions were off. So you would probably have to buy a flight to Moscow and then take a domestic flight there or something like
Right.
that.
Usually,
Yeah.
like typically when you Google something like that, it'll tell you, okay, you need to take a flight to like South Korea. Then from South Korea, you get, But in this
Yeah.
case, it's just unavailable. So
I think Google Flights it has like Google itself has sanctioned Russia because it doesn't show Google.
right,
Doesn't show.
it could have
Expedia
been
doesn't
Google.
either.
Yeah, right. Okay, so
Expedia doesn't
I should
either.
try like DuckDuckGo or something. Yeah.
My next question is for Toby. I'm making a point here. So Abhinav, I'm going to get to you in the end, but I'm making a point here. I want to establish that which countries have their vested interest in keeping the war going, and which country doesn't really care, or which country would prefer it to finish as soon as possible. Because if it keeps going, I think currently what's happening with NATO is that they're just falling short of not entering the war directly, to not take it nuclear, or to not make it even worse. But they're doing as much as possible. So that explain to me, it explains enough that there are enough countries that have interest in keeping this war going, just not expanding it to the rest of Europe or rest of NATO countries. So, which brings me to Toby. What changes have you felt in Australia since the war started? What about the did it affect Australia in a worse way? And I'm not talking about the regular Australian. I understand that the inflation is high. I understand that maybe in Australia recession is coming. I'm not sure, but what about the GDP and the whole country? How is Australia faring in term since the war started?
Okay, well, I don't believe in countries. I think they're a fiction. But Australia is the biggest global exporter of LNG, right? We are a LNG superpower. We've also just delivered our first shipment to Rotterdam. So Australia, if you believe in such a thing, or at least the corporations that own the gas supply in Australia, are doing fantastic business. We're a direct beneficiary. So probably a better way to say is the OECD gas suppliers, right? The West, if you like, is doing great. And Australia will get, their kickback. We'll get the royalties out of that. We're not going to get the sort of economic development that people at universities like to talk about, because basically the LNG terminals are big floating offshore platforms, and people fly in and out, and it's as few workers as they can possibly have. It's very robotic, it's very automated. But, there is some economic benefit there, but it's not like there are any local communities that are getting any contracts to supply that project or anything like that. It's a very, very corporate enterprise, and it's a very global corporate enterprise. It's kind of the model for the new world. If I can talk a bit about why I don't believe in countries, if we have a look at Europe, right, like there are some pretty peculiar facts about the countries there. All the countries in Europe like to imagine that they are in the EU, but they also like to imagine that they're in NATO, right? Now, neither the EU nor NATO is a country. And indeed, the EU and NATO are kind of competing. It's a curious fact that more than 80% of the funding for NATO comes from outside the EU, right? Because you've got Turkey, the UK, the US, and Norway. So nearly all of NATO's funding comes from outside the EU. And the EU and NATO are very much competing in many areas. So, for example, the EU for a long time has been talking about a new security architecture, and people who are very pro-EU want to build an EU army, and they want to take on responsibility for their own defense. Jens Stoltenberg has said openly in recent years that this is a ridiculous idea. He's not in favor of this at all. And so he says that they have to work together. But don't let that fool you. This is they're putting on a united face. But if you look at the different blocs in Europe, some are for the OECD program and globalism and NATO and American involvement in Europe. Others would much rather be doing business with Russia as an independent Europe and manage their own defense. But it's not just defense. So, for example, in something that you might think is domestic, like energy policy, well, NATO have opened up a department that looks suspiciously like a government department to manage energy policy in Europe, right? So what's that about? Like, is NATO a supranational government organization? Are they a country? Are they what are they? And for that matter, what is the EU? So when we talk about countries, who cares? The countries of Europe are largely as irrelevant as the country of Australia. When it comes to what's happening geopolitically and economically, we really need to be talking about the West, by which we mean the OECD nations, and the others, right, who aren't in the OECD. And this is why, Putin in his recent speech talked about Russia's right to be powerful, right? Well, this is that's what's on the chopping board here. That's what this is largely about. And China, you can see why China is positioned the way it is, because do they have the right to be powerful? Do any of the BRICS? Does India? So yeah, I'm not sure this is so much about countries, and I don't think countries have economies either. I think people do, and so yeah, I'm not sure. In some ways, I would say you could look at the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline as having nothing to do with Russia. You could very much describe that, if you wanted to, as an attack by NATO on the EU, right? In the realm of energy policy. NATO decided to lay down the law and to destroy these European dreams of creating their own independent entity that traded with Russia. If you have a look at NATO's own publications, they're very bold and very brazen in what they say. They mention deals between independent European states, countries, if you like, and Russia as being just off the table, unthinkable, right? That they're against that. And so what NATO is and what the OECD is, these are big geopolitical questions, but countries, like, who cares? They're very much irrelevant in the geopolitics.
I would like to underscore what you said. I would like to underscore what you said, but I would also like to nuance it slightly more, because I would agree with you that NATO and EU is not necessarily the same thing. Indeed, they do have very conflicting interests, but their interests are the countries' interests are subordinated. However, the countries do constitute a part of these different groups. So, like, Norway is not a part of EU, but it is a part of NATO. Many of those in the EU are a part of NATO, but the EU is more like an economic agreement, whereas NATO is a military agreement. What actually makes these two institutions similar, really, is as it pertains to countries, I guess maybe, is that they don't have an independent foreign policy. Like, the EU doesn't have a foreign policy by its own, really. It always follows and caters to the US, I mean. And likewise for NATO countries, especially when it comes to foreign affairs and military things, that applies the same. So, like, Norway and UK, alongside with the EU countries, like you said, we don't really have much of a say in that regard. Like, countries become in that regard irrelevant, but they are pawns important for managing these institutions and in a geopolitical context. So yeah, but I'm not disagreeing. I just wanted to add that on here.
Yeah, I definitely disagree. So I think because the examples you're giving and the problems you're seeing is purely in the OECD countries, the EU and the US. So you're taking a very Western perspective on this. Whereas if you look at the rest of the world, the countries are countries. Singapore is a country, Malaysia is a country, China is a country, India is a country. And what is a country? A country is just a political entity that decides its own foreign policy, its own economic policy, its own internal governing policies, and the governing body above that does that. In
That's
the EU,
that's right, Drew. A country is a
Yeah.
place that declares the right to be powerful and have its own culture. And let me tell you, NATO is not important. They don't approve.
Yeah, so
know.
there's a mess in the West, in the form of overlapping kind of jurisdictions trying to claim more power for their own organization, and at the expense of other overlapping organizations. So
Well,
you're right,
Drew,
it is messy in the EU, but the way I see it is the way why it is messy now in the EU is they're in a period of transition. Yeah, just look at I mean, when I talk about Europe, I always say it's basically a China that is fragmented. If you look at the Asian the Eurasian continent, right, on the right side you have China with all its provinces. That's basically like you can compare, like Fujian could be a France, Chongqing could be a Germany, Beijing could be a Britain and whatnot. Each of those were its own countries in the past, and through war and political shenanigans and whatnot, they merged a few thousand years ago, and then they kind of stayed merged after a while. Europe is kind of in the process of that. Its EU is kind of partway merging the whole European continent into one. So it's if it actually manages to do that, and instead of having all the little countries, it becomes a country of Europe, then then the country, you'll be a lot stronger, you'll be a lot more relevant on the world stage. No, but it's in the transition process. It's trying to find its way there, because there's a lot of different people in Europe, different ideas and different cultures. But I think it's in the right direction. Because
may
for
I
it to
agree and
be relevant,
disagree with
it
both of
has
you?
to eventually. Yeah.
We should hear
If I
from
may,
Abhinav in a while.
if I may agree or disagree, Drew, what you're saying, like the countries outside of NATO, for example, are their own countries, they whatever, so forth, because they're political entities, which is correct. But on that note, it's worth noting that just because you have, shall we say, political sovereignty, doesn't mean you have economic sovereignty. And this is very much true for most countries in Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, and also to some extent several countries in Far East Asia. And so, I think still Toby would be somewhat correct, like maybe to a lesser extent outside of NATO and to a more extent outside NATO, depending on the context. But this kind of pertains back to is the EU countries, right? Like you said, like China is one thing, the EU is not. Well, this is in part because the EU is also, somewhat politically sovereign, but it is also economically beholden to the bigger powers otherwise. And so the individual countries don't really have much to say about how their economies are to be run. For example, they are to be beholden to bigger interests that are more closely tied to U.S. interests, for example, most of the time. Right? So I think you're kind of correct. Like it kind of, there's more nuance to it, generally speaking. But as it pertains to the EU and NATO and as we're going to hopefully get into Ukraine, Toby, I'm inclined to believe Toby is slightly more correct in that regard.
I'd like to comment on that. I think if we compare, let's say, how India is against, let's say, Japan, and we compare it to the United States, you'd find that consumer behavior in all of these countries is different. So it's true that we have sovereignty on the one end, where you have the countries deciding their own political futures. But on the other hand, it's also true that it's really the money which is in the global sphere that drives policy. So yes, definitely the European policy or the US policy is going to have a big impact on Indian policy as well. But um, because of the differences of consumer behavior, of culture, how that money flows in the economy is very different. So, for example, Walmart tried to enter India. Citibank did a few decades ago. They haven't really succeeded. Walmart is still there, but the way they do business is different. Coca-Cola entered, but again, it's mainly working through franchisees. So yes, you can influence, but there's definitely a big country element involved. It's a bit there that yes, a big entity can, with a huge ton of money, really buy the government, a part of the government, and influence policy. But it will only take you so far, because the people of the country will ultimately decide whether that's going to lead to profits or not. And if there are no profits, people would exit.
I think you made a very important distinction there, because when we're talking about countries, I think we're talking about countries generally speaking, not massive powerhouses like the U.S., Ukraine, no, U.S., Russia, China, and India as well. Because I don't think it's I agree with Abhinav. It's not fair to kind of put them in the same basket of countries that kind of don't exist in terms of sovereignty and so forth. So,
Well,
yeah.
it reminds me of another example, Iran. Iran was economically subordinated to U.S. and UK for a long time, until their ruler or whatever, their main guy comes in, and they basically nationalize all of their gas. And since then, Iran has always been like a villain for the West, and still exists, still is. And I think that's a major reason that they do want the nukes as well. So that's something very interesting that Abhinav did bring up, which brings me to the next question for Abhinav. And how is India profiting or suffering from this war? And is India's interest in ending this war promptly, or for it to go long enough but not become a bigger conflict?
So, well, to address the first question, I think India's, as regarding this war, India has always taken military support from Russia to a greater extent as compared to the rest of the West, um, for various reasons. But one of the big reasons is that historically, India has benefited from Soviet support, especially at a critical juncture during the 1971 war, in which there was a direct confrontation. And so it came very close to war with the United States. And really, Soviet intervention prevented India from getting into that. And India was able to conclude a quick 13-day war with Pakistan. So there's those historical ties which are really important, because such flames have been fanned over the decades. So you don't even know when a small uh, flame could become a huge fire. So India does require military support, and since India is a big country, it is surrounded by countries which are weak. So we know what Sri Lanka is going through. We know what Myanmar is. We know that India and China don't always have the best relationships. With Pakistan, of course, there's been this conflict. So Nepal, again, China influence. So in all of this situation, it's really Russia. You know that there would be some support from Russia if things really go south from a military perspective. And so that assurance is really important. So from this perspective, India to take a strong stance against Russia is really difficult, politically speaking. India can at best go for neutrality, which is what it has done. It has condemned violence, but it doesn't want to use the word condemn in the official UN resolution, because ultimately India doesn't want to take sides at all. So from India's perspective, getting discounted oil is great. India is getting like a big fat discount on Russian oil. And if we bought at market prices, it would be much, much more. And if you look at the percentage of Indian supplies coming from Russia, it's more than a quarter now. And it used to be 3% or something. So under 5% at least before the war. So it's been a huge take from 3 to 5% to 25% in less than a year. And this is despite not having insurance in the first few months. So there's been a problem, and now Russian rubles can be directly used in the process. Again, India had a system with Iran a few years ago that was dismantled as a mechanism, but for a few years, India traded directly in Indian rupees with Iran as a result of sanctions. So India has benefited from this. You can call it opportunistic, certainly, but frankly speaking, for a country like India, which is quite poor, if you look at the population and the total income, it will take every penny it gets from wherever it can get. And so, how long the war continues, honestly, it doesn't really matter. Um, from an Indian perspective, I honestly think it's going to take 3 to 5 years for this thing to really normalize. And so, really, for India, from an economic perspective, imports are a really high cost. So as long as fertilizer cost is a big problem, we have a lot of other inputs from Russia. If these input costs stay at elevated levels and cause a commodity price hike or commodity price superinflation, that's going to be a problem, not just for India, for a lot of countries. So it's really the problem of commodity prices. Otherwise, really, it doesn't bother India how long it's going to continue.
May I ask you a question? Because as far as I've understood it, the India actually also sold much of the oil that was on a discount. Like it's because the discount the Russians gave actually didn't mean that they sold necessarily that much lower, because the global prices were rising anyways. So India got to buy it at the same price as it was, or even lower. But as far as I understood it, they also sold quite of the oil to a profit. The oil they imported from Russia, they sold with a profit, and they did. If Drew may correct me here, but as far as I understood it, one of the main mechanisms were to be trading in through the stock market using ATFs, not ETFs, and they would just buy oil rights, which they sold to the EU at a higher price. They buy the oil rights cheaper, they sold it to the EU, and so they made a profit. Which basically, now just to conclude my question here, sort of an assertion, I guess, is that India, in many ways, like Norway, would have incentives for this war to continue. Like it doesn't matter if Ukraine or Russia wins. Actually, the longer time it takes for them to win, the more both countries can benefit.
If I can interject here, I just want to make the point that you can't look at the current oil market without taking into account the fact that the US is releasing huge amounts of its strategic reserve of oil into the market to depress the price, to harm Russia's oil incomes. In response, Russia has reduced its export volumes of oil because Russia knows, I mean, you can go and anyone can Google this and have a look at the volume of oil that's in the US strategic reserve. If America keeps playing planned economy here and keeps depressing the market the way it has been, it's going to be 12 months and they won't have any strategic reserve of oil left. And at that point, all that oversupply is going to be gone. The oil price is going to shoot up. It's going to rocket up. And then Russia can come back into the market with the oil that it hasn't sold because it's reduced its sale, and it's going to really profit. So the oil market at the moment globally, it's very good for big buyers like India and China because the price is low. But the reason the price is low is because the Americans are using their strategic reserve to glut the market. And again, if you Google it and have a look at the volumes involved, this is a very short-term strategy. It's also a very bizarre strategy. And you know, I bet there are a lot of people in the Pentagon who are pulling their hair out about this because the US is depleting its strategic oil reserves before it's getting into a war, which is hard to enjoy if you're a military.
Which is the real reason. All the other fluff aside, what you're saying there, Toby, is the real reason the United States is our ally, because they help our oil prices go up, and we can predict it in beforehand, and we can manipulate on the prices and just be opportunistic. So yeah.
Yeah. So let's correct a couple of misconceptions here. The ETFs got nothing to do with the oil transfers or anything like that. So what's happening is basically there are a bunch of refiners in China, and I assume India. I'm not so sure about India. So the refiners have extra capacity, so they're just buying oil, and oil is being shipped to these refiners. So the oil refineries will refine the oil, and then all the oil products that come out, like diesel and whatnot, is now Chinese diesel or Indian diesel. So you can't tell that this oil is from Russia anymore, because that's the raw material that goes into the refinery. So then this diesel, this Chinese diesel, Indian diesel, is then on sold to the other countries that could have sanctioned Russian oil. So it's yeah, there's no way for them to tell anyway.
Well, that is one thing, but as far as I've understood it, because that may be one thing, but there are some logistical issues or limitations, maybe I should say, to that. And because the reason I'm pointing this out is because gas and oil is actually still flowing through Ukraine. Like, Ukraine is still making money off it, and it's flowing through from Russia to Europe, and the sanctions would otherwise be stopping it, but the reason they haven't is because they have been doing trades on the side that enable it to be going through, but then then it gives investment on return for, let's say, India right?
Gas is different, because gas, you need a pipeline, or you need to freeze it.
But the oil is also going through a pipeline.
No, all you can ship it on ships. LNG gas, you need to freeze it first in a terminal, and then you can transport it in the LNG ships. But oil, you can just ship the oil, and gas, you can't refine it. So the gas is the gas. It's either frozen gas or pipeline non-frozen gas. Whereas oil, you refine it, and then you mix it with other oils and mix it with other things to make plastics and diesel and gasoline and all the.
Well, but so far, unless I am terribly mistaken, the oil is still going through, the gas is still going through, and Europe already had the refineries for converting it to do whatever products they wanted. They had their petrochemical
so the refineries are screwed. The European refineries are screwed because they lost their raw material. So all the Chinese
it hasn't been shut down though. You guys know that?
Because I think I read something that the oil flow stopped. I could be wrong, but I think I did read somewhere that the oil flow through Ukraine has stopped.
I also just want to add on the Russian early February, 10th of February, announced that they will be reducing their oil production by 5%, which is 500 barrels per day from March onwards. So currently, we are in March, so they have officially reduced the production. So that actually drive up the price again by 2.5% upon the news during February. So I'm not sure what's the oil price now in compared to then, but the Russians are not sitting there and waiting for people to
the geniuses in the Biden administration might have accelerated the depletion of their stockpiles in response to keep the price low.
But I honestly don't think the Biden administration actually released a strategic reserve to push the oil price globally down to fight Russia. If you notice, when they did it, it was more of a pre-election kind of thing. They were trying to keep their oil prices in the US oil price low, so that it doesn't, the regular guy who doesn't care about politics doesn't realize that, hey, why is the oil price suddenly go up, and then start to ask questions. So
not only that, as far as I've understood it, that's not only correct, but it's also because the fracking industry was pre-war not very profitable in the first place. And sure, they're getting a boost by having them ship LNG terminals over to Germany and all that. But generally speaking, American oil exports benefit from high prices. So releasing strategic reserves in order to get down global prices wouldn't make much sense. But to kind of have a little bit more internal control, I would fully agree with Drew for the reasons mentioned.
And